famously, Hitler and Mussolini as fascists were, I'm not sure, would you call Hitler technically a fascist or a National Socialist? Was very, obviously Mussolini was a fascist, completely anti-Bolshevik.
Yeah.
And Stalin himself wrote a whole book about why Lenin was wrong, or what Lenin got wrong.
Yeah.
So they were anti-Lenin on a range thing. They were anti-Lenin, right?
Yeah.
So how exactly were they?
So Marxist-Leninism, that ultimately the similarities, outweigh the differences. So a lot of times people, one, centralization of power, utility of violence, total control over the information, total control over speech, making sure that only the party is in charge. These are also the hallmarks that they all had in common. And then when people point out, when people really try to draw this huge distinction between communism and fascism / Nazism. But as I said, I think the similarities outweigh the differences. But they point to the racism because National Socialism had because in communism, the idea is that it's an internationalist movement, that essentially anybody in theory potentially could be, part of their movement. And that sounds nicer. And in many ways it is. It's more universalist. But Nazism, fascism was an idea of the important unit is the nation state and the race. And so they were much more explicitly racist. But when people really talk about that as being the major difference between that and Soviet communism, I'm kind of like, well, are you telling me that the Soviets weren't actually racist? That there wasn't actually substantial racism actually in the Soviet Union? Then I feel like you've possibly never met a Russian or know your history very well.
No, quite.
Was it less dramatic and awful than the horrors that happened under Hitler? Yes, undoubtedly. But in terms of both being totalitarian systems with very similar aspects all the way through, that it makes it a little bit ridiculous when still people on the left will say, oh, but that's that's fascism, but somehow have a soft spot for communism. It's monstrous and also bad history.
Well, we actually had Nathan Sharansky on the show when we were starting, and he's perfect. We had a good conversation about how anti-Semitism was rife throughout. I mean, even before, obviously, the communists came to power. But it seemed to me that one thing that game they did play, and now we're kind of heading away from free speech a little bit, was that
sure
whereas the communists made it about class, the Nazis made it about race.
Yes.
But they kind of played the same game. There's an oppressor group who we need to get rid of because of all the kind of evil.
And that's about the idea of the Volk, essentially, which kind of combined race and class, essentially the Volk being the regular working people. And I actually don't think it's that divorced from freedom of speech, because when this stuff starts rearing its head and we didn't have a reckoning about being like, oh my, so Alan Charles Coors is a co-founder of FIRE, and he gave this absolutely beautiful speech that Daniel Schuckman just wrote about in the Wall Street Journal, talking about we never had our after socialism moment. We never had the moment where we said, oh my God, this was a monstrous period in human history where rights were thrown to one side, it's bathed in blood, and we never actually had the moment.
In America.
In the world. In the world.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that if we're refusing to, and I think in a lot of ways we have refused to actually think about this, we're going to go back into a tyranny again. So I do actually think this is closely related to free speech, because the biggest threat to free speech in the 20th century was ideology.
One thing we've covered a lot on this show is that not having reckoned with socialism and communism, and it's kind of took the wrong lessons from the Second World War, and I think we're seeing that play out in a very weird way, particularly here in America, where a lot of right wingers are interpreting that as the wrong people won. And that's kind of a weird perversion of 1945. But it is the case that communism, socialism got an easy go. I mean, everyone from Karl Popper, who was not that harsh on Karl Marx.
Isn't that crazy, though? I mean, because I'm such a Karl Popper fan, but it's clear that he was raised believing that Karl Marx was essentially a nice, well-meaning man.
Yeah.
And he he totally savages Hegel, which I love. He totally savages Plato's Republic, which I love. And then he gets to Marx, and he's kind of like, well,
he might be wrong, but his intentions are clearly in the right place. And
then in the Open Society, and it's one of like the later editions of it, there's this kind of note, I think it's like a paragraph where he says, like, the recent biography that I read, I didn't realize like he was such a terrible person.
Yes, that's correct. He does kind of put as a weird caveat, but it's not particularly heavy-handed caveat.
And it's like, and that's such an understatement. He was a horrible person.
Yeah.
Now, I say this all the time, and this was one of the points in my book, Canceling of the American Mind, is that bad people can have good ideas as well. But I do find it particularly ironic that oftentimes the same people who will try to cancel David Hume for having a racist footnote in 1752 totally give Karl Marx, and I think David, I can't think of his name right now, but he will give Karl Marx a pass, even though he was deeply racist, incredibly anti-Semitic, even though his family was Jewish, maybe even because his family was Jewish.
But not David Hume.
But David Hume, for having a footnote, let's erase him. But Karl Marx, his heart was in the right place.
Well, actually, where I think this, why Popper links to free speech, is that a lot of the attitude against free speech, I think, starts with the never again lessons from World War II.
Yeah.
And Karl Popper, I mean, viewers who regularly watch this show will maybe be bored of me talking about Karl Popper.
The paradox of tolerance?
Yes, exactly, which is a deep footnote in that book, The Open Societies, where he says, we've got to have, and the whole book argues we've got to have freedom and liberalism, and we've got to work against authoritarianism. But in this footnote, we must not tolerate the intolerance, and it's pretty explicit in being anti. He's shown his limits there, which I think had a huge, despite it being a footnote, was hugely impactful philosophically in the idea of closing down hate speech.
And to me, like, they're not even reading the footnote right, because like the beginning of the footnote seems to be saying that we should have done more to shut down the Nazis, and there are a million different ways they could have shut down the Nazis that didn't involve going after their speech. They were murderers. It would have been incredibly easy to go after them on that. And by the way, Weimar, and this is something Popper probably didn't know or remember, Weimar Germany did punish the Nazis for speech. It wasn't the fact that Weimar was incredibly tolerant.
Is that right?
Yeah, of freedom of speech. This is called the Weimar fallacy. It even has a name. The Nazis went to jail for saying anti-Semitic things, for real. And guess what happened when they got out of jail? The Nazis would throw them a big party, and they'd turn it into a big PR coup that essentially,
because they're martyrs.
Yeah, because they're martyrs. Exactly. And so the first part of it seems to be saying we could have done more to stop the Nazis, of the footnote, and absolutely they could have. The second part gets a little bit, seems almost self-contradictory to the first part of it, but, with some sort of nice sounding language about not tolerating intolerance. And
even not tolerating things that might incite intolerance.
Yeah.
So it's, again, that word incites in there. All of this language, as we're still using it.
Yeah, and I think it's used to justify things that Popper never would have supported, including, the kind of hate speech laws that we currently have. I think it's much more specific about the scenario that's exactly like...
I'm not clear about a lot of people make this argument because a lot of the book is about freedom and freedom of speech. But the fact that he wrote that, it might be that it was a failing in his own thinking.
Yeah.
That it might be the case he didn't actually support all free speech.
Yeah.
So
I think it's if you live through the horrors of World War II, there might be some caveat or somebody sort of niggling at your consciousness, or literally someone being kind of like, hey, maybe you should make a footnote about this. It's like, fine,
Right.
But I think the overall, I think his overall oeuvre is about freedom, with a caveat that ended up being, again, in a footnote, which probably should have been ignored to a large degree because it's a freaking footnote, but has been leapt on by people to say basically, well, this justifies my entire anti-free speech, anti-open society regime.
Yeah.
Which he'd probably be pretty horrified by.
The footnote that changed the West.
Yes.
Thanks for watching this clip from The Winston Marshall Show. You can click here to watch the full episode, and for more clips like this one, don't forget to subscribe. And as always, be well.